Story number 1. The Great Dismal Swamp. I should have known better. Really, I should have. But sometimes, curiosity has a way of clouding your better judgment. Doesn't it? It's that old saying. What you don't know can't hurt you. Except, well, I found out the hard way that sometimes it can. And sometimes, what you do know might be the worst thing to realize when you're standing in the middle of nowhere, at the mercy of something you can't explain. We were just 4 friends, all of us college kids, just finishing up our final year, looking for one last adventure before we all split up for good. The Great Dismal Swamp sounded like a perfect place to end the chapter. It was isolated, strange, and most importantly, untouched by the world's need to impose itself on every corner of the map. Most people stayed away from the swamp, but that only made it more appealing to us. We packed up our camping gear, loaded it into my beat-up Jeep, and headed south toward Virginia and the borders of North Carolina. It was early autumn, that time when the nights get crisp and the forest smells like wood smoke and decay. We joked as we drove, poking fun at the local myths, the stories about the ghosts of runaway slaves who supposedly found freedom in the swamp, only to be swallowed by it. The tales had circulated for centuries, a place so full of death, so tangled in history, that it had become a cemetery for the lost. I scoffed, but I knew that we weren't going to find any ghosts. What we would find, I thought, was just isolation, nature at its wildest. We set up camp in a small clearing near a creek that snaked through the swamp like a silver thread. The trees around us stretched high, their limbs intertwining into a canopy that blotted out most of the sky. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of earth felt ancient, as though the ground beneath us had been here long before any of us. It was unsettling, but also mesmerizing. I didn't know it then, but I was already feeling it, the thing that we would never be able to outrun. That night, the usual sounds of the swamp, the croak of frogs, the rustle of leaves, the far-off hoot of an owl were strangely absent. It was just too quiet, the kind of quiet that gnaws at you, making you question whether you're really alone, or whether there's something watching from the dark. We built a fire and sat around it, laughing, talking, pushing the unease away. But then, at some point in the night, things began to change. I was the first to hear it. A whisper, just a murmur at the edge of my hearing, so faint that at first I thought it was the wind, or maybe one of the others moving around. But then it came again, clearer this time. My name, Charlie. I froze. I had heard it as clear as day. It wasn't the voice of any of my friends. It was just there, a voice that didn't belong. Did anyone just say something? I asked, my voice sounding thick and uncertain even to my own ears. The others stopped talking and looked at me. Nathan, our most skeptical friend, raised an eyebrow. What are you talking about? I shook my head. I could have sworn I heard my name. A laugh, forced and nervous, broke the silence. Dude, you're just hearing things, Will said, trying to make light of it. It's probably just an owl or something. But it wasn't an owl. It was too human. And it wasn't just the one time. No, it came again. This time, a different voice. Softer, more insistent. Charlie, Charlie. My heart pounded. I glanced around, scanning the darkness that stretched beyond the firelight. But there was nothing. No movement. No signs of life. Just the sound of the swamp, thick and wet around us. I told myself I was imagining it. It was just the swamp playing tricks on me. But that's the thing about fear, it's not rational. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. It just creeps up on you until it's all you can hear, all you can feel. I glanced at the others. Nathan was poking the fire, looking bored. But Will and Sarah were scanning the woods, their eyes darting nervously. I'm going to check out the creek, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. See if I can find anything cool. Are you sure that's a good idea? I asked. I wanted to sound casual, but my voice cracked a little. She just nodded and grabbed a flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, dancing over the trees as she walked away, her footsteps soft on the thick, wet ground. We heard her scream before we saw her. It was a short, sharp sound, like someone had just ripped her breath from her chest. A scream that died almost as quickly as it had come, leaving behind an eerie, painful silence. "Sarah," Will shouted. "Sarah, what's wrong?" We all leapt to our feet, the firelight flickering wildly, casting long, distorted shadows. I don't know how I knew, but I knew. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I knew that something had happened. Something was wrong. We ran towards the creek, hearts pounding, breath shallow. But when we reached the water, there was no sign of Sarah. No flashlight, no Sarah. Only the swamp, quiet, waiting. We called her name, shouted it, over and over, but there was no answer, just the same unnatural silence. Then, from deep in the woods, came the sound of something moving, something big. The brush parted, just enough to let the moonlight slip through, and I saw it. A figure, a silhouette, standing just inside the trees. His back was to us, but I saw enough to know it was her. "Sarah!" I screamed. "Sarah, what the hell is going on?" But when she turned around, it wasn't her face I saw. It was something else, something wrong. The features were stretched and twisted, like a mockery of her, like the swamp had taken what was left of her soul and contorted it into something unrecognizable. And then she smiled. I can't describe it. The way her mouth opened impossibly wide. How it was more like a crevice than a smile. The skin around her lips pulled back in ways that made me want to throw up. And as she opened her mouth, the same whisper I'd heard earlier, my name, came from her lips. "Charlie." That was when we ran. We didn't look back. We didn't have to. We could feel her behind us, following. The branches of the trees scraping against our faces. The cold, damp air cutting at our skin. The breath of something far older than us in our ears. The swamp. It was alive. Alive with something that had no intention of letting us leave. I don't remember how we made it back to the Jeep. I don't even remember driving out of the swamp. The next thing I knew, we were standing at the edge of the woods, staring back at the dark expanse we had just barely escaped from. We never found Sarah, and I don't think we ever will. But I'll never forget the way she looked when she smiled. And I'll never forget what the swamp whispered, just before we left. "Charlie, Charlie, you should have stayed." Story number 2. The Silent City. I've never been one for grand conspiracy theories or the sort of legends that get told around campfires, especially the ones involving ancient cities hidden beneath the ice. But I'll tell you this, after what happened to me down there, I wish I'd been one of those people who simply brushed it all off. Because what we found wasn't something that could easily be explained. It wasn't just the absence of life that was eerie. It was the silence. The kind of silence that eats at you, makes you question if the world is really as empty as it appears, if we're truly alone, or if there are things in the dark that are just waiting for the right moment to remind us that we never were. This wasn't supposed to be my story. It was supposed to be a regular research trip. Just another one of those expeditions that get filed away under data collection in some dusty folder at the Antarctic Research Institute. It started like any other, with a group of scientists, all of us dressed in thick layers of Arctic gear, trudging through the snow. Half a dozen colleagues from various corners of the world, all with their own reasons for being there. Some were looking for climate data, others for ancient fossils. I was part of a small geology team, tasked with surveying the landscape for unusual geological formations. It sounded like a boring but safe job, one I could do in my sleep. We flew in on a military transport, a hulking metal bird that cut through the frozen sky like a knife through butter. Landing on the icy continent felt like stepping into a void, like the earth itself had swallowed everything but us. No birds, no animals, no wind. Just a heavy, unbroken silence that pressed down on everything. You could hear your own breath, the crunch of your boots on the snow. But that was it. The whole place felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something big, something ancient. The locals, the few people who had worked in the area, talked about the place we were headed to in hushed tones. The Silent City, they called it. It was no more than a whisper among those who had dared venture to the farthest reaches of the world. They spoke of it like it was a place cursed. No one who went there ever came back the same. But these were just stories. You can't expect scientists to believe in stories, no matter how much they spooked the locals. We made our way to the site, a place that had only recently been uncovered by the shifting ice. The city, if you could call it that, was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The structures looked almost too perfect, straight lines, symmetrical, and completely out of place in the wilderness of snow and rock. It didn't feel like a city, it felt like a tomb. The walls were made of some sort of dark stone, smooth and cold to the touch, as though they had been carved by hands that were not human. No inscriptions, no carvings, no signs of life. It was dead. Everything about it was dead. But as we explored further, it became clear that this silence wasn't just a lack of life. It was something deeper, something far more oppressive. The first sign of something wrong was the temperature. It was colder in the city than it was outside. Much colder. My breath came out in sharp clouds, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck prickle as if the air itself was thickening. The others felt it too. We tried to brush it off. Maybe it was the building materials. Maybe the ice had trapped some deep frost within the walls, but deep down, we all knew something wasn't right. This wasn't natural. We split up to cover more ground, moving deeper into the city. The silence was overwhelming, as if every sound was being swallowed by the vastness of the empty streets. The only thing that broke the stillness was the faint sound of something like metal scraping on stone, distant and far away. We couldn't pinpoint the source, and no one dared ask out loud what it might have been. That's when we started to notice the footprints. They weren't human. They weren't animal. They were too large, too wide. Something had walked through the city, and it wasn't us. They led from one building to another, disappearing around corners, vanishing into the walls as though they were never meant to be seen. By then, we were all starting to feel it, the weight of the place, pressed down on us like an invisible hand, squeezing tighter with every step. It was like the city was watching us, or worse, waiting for us. We camped in one of the larger buildings that night, and that's when the first of the strange noises began. They started as faint whispers, like the wind outside was carrying voices across the ice. But there was no wind. The air inside the city was still. The whispers grew louder, becoming a soft murmur, then a scratching, tapping sound that seemed to come from deep within the stone. At first, we assumed it was the building settling, but as the hours passed, the sounds became more distinct, more deliberate. Some of the team swore they could hear their names being called. Low, guttural voices. Others, myself included, heard the faintest thud, as if something was walking behind us, just out of sight. We'd turn around, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing there. That night, couldn't sleep. I kept hearing footsteps, close but not too close, like someone was walking just on the other side of the wall. But no one else seemed to hear it. I could feel the presence of someone watching me, waiting. I got up, grabbed my gear, and walked to the entrance of the building. As I stepped outside, the cold hit me like a slap in the face. But it didn't matter. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That's when I saw it. The figure, in the distance, standing perfectly still, like it was waiting for me. The pale moonlight barely illuminated its form, but I could make out the rough outline of a humanoid shape, and it was staring directly at me. I froze. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, the team was in chaos. Several people had been affected by strange dreams, nightmares that left them shaken. Some couldn't speak about it. Some couldn't even remember. But we all felt the same unease. We packed up quickly, leaving behind the silent city, its walls standing tall and cold, a monument to something older than time. We've never spoken of it since. Not openly. Not without the unease creeping back into our voices. No one went back to the city. The research ended abruptly. And no one really knew what happened to those who went there before us. The ones who discovered the place and left with more questions than answers. As far as I know, they never returned. Now, I know what you're thinking. It's just a ghost story. A bad dream. Something to laugh about at a bar over a few drinks. But I can tell you there was something there. Something ancient. And I think we were meant to find it. Maybe it was a warning. Or maybe it was something worse. Something that had been waiting for centuries. Lying dormant beneath the ice. Waiting for us to stumble upon it. And I don't think I'll ever understand why. But one thing's for sure, the Silent City isn't just a relic. It's a trap, a warning, and whatever's watching, waiting, has no intention of letting us forget. If you ever find yourself standing at the edge of that frozen wasteland, don't go looking for the Silent City. Some things are meant to stay buried. Some things are best left undisturbed. Because once you hear the whispers, once you feel the eyes on your back, you might not make it out the same way you came in. And sometimes, you might not make it out at all. Story number 3. The Wendigo. There are moments in life when the line between the natural and the supernatural blurs so thin, so fine, that you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. That's what happened to me one winter in the Canadian wilderness, when I found myself face to face with something I couldn't explain. Something that might have been better left to the realm of myth and folklore. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and you'll have to bear with me as I tell you the story the way it happened. Because believe me, it wasn't the kind of thing I could have ever imagined. And it was certainly no damn campfire story. It all started with an invitation. A stupid one if you ask me now. The kind of thing that, at the time, seemed harmless enough. But looking back, I can't help but wonder if I was being led into something darker. Something I wasn't supposed to see. I was with a group of old college friends. Guys who had been in the same dorm, taking the same classes, pulling the same all-nighters. We'd all drifted apart after graduation. But somehow, over the years, we stayed in touch. So when Paul, our ringleader, suggested we do a boys' weekend up in the Canadian woods, I didn't think much of it. The idea of camping in a remote forest, far from civilization, seemed refreshing. Even a chance to leave behind our daily lives and return to something simpler. A retreat, a reset. But even before we packed up the trucks and made the long drive north from Toronto to the woods, there was something about that trip that felt off. We arrived at the campgrounds in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low, casting long shadows across the trees. The place was isolated. Not another soul in sight for miles. The kind of place that felt like it could be the setting of a horror movie, silent, eerie. The kind of silence that seeps into your bones and makes you start looking over your shoulder. The first few hours were fine. We set up camp, cracked open a few beers, and started a fire. The familiar crackle of the flames and the laughter of my friends were the only sounds that filled the air. But as the night settled in, something else started to fill the space, something far less friendly. I'm not sure exactly when it started, but it wasn't long before I noticed that the woods around us seemed alive in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the usual sounds of rustling leaves or distant animal calls. There was a deeper presence. Something moving just beyond the reach of the firelight. Something watching us. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks on me. But then, when I looked at the others, I saw it in their eyes too. Something was wrong. Paul was the first to mention it. His voice low, almost a whisper, as if afraid of saying it out loud. "Did anyone else hear that?" he asked, his eyes scanning the dark trees. "Hear what?" I replied, forcing a laugh to cover up the tension building in my chest. "It's like something's out there," Paul said, frowning, "like footsteps or breathing." We all fell silent, straining our ears. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of crackling fire and the occasional snap of a twig. But then, just as Paul had described it, a low rattle, like the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. Not an animal, No, it was too deliberate, too measured, like something pacing. Stop messing around, I said, but my voice wavered. It wasn't like Paul to joke around like that, and the woods were far too quiet to dismiss it as imagination. But then, out of nowhere, we all heard it, faint rustling, far off in the distance, closer this time. Then, a thudding sound. Thud, thud, thud. It was the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps, deliberate and steady, like something was walking toward us. One footstep at a time. We all turned our heads toward the forest, our bodies rigid, frozen in place. And then, it came. A shadow, just a glimpse at first, flitted between the trees, so quick, so fluid, that none of us could make it out clearly. But it was tall, too tall, and moving in a way that no human could. Did you see that? Dave's voice cracked. He was the youngest of us, the most eager to brush things off as nerves. But I could hear the tremor in his voice. I saw it, I said, my throat dry. But what the hell was it? Maybe it's just an animal, Mark suggested, but even he didn't sound sure. His voice was edged with a new kind of fear, the kind you only hear when someone realizes they're out of their depth. We didn't speak much after that. The fire flickered, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to stretch toward us, clawing at the air. The wind picked up, a soft whistle through the branches overhead. And then, just when I thought I might relax a little, the whispering started. It wasn't loud at first, just a soft murmur, like the rustling of leaves in the breeze. But it was coming from all around us, swirling through the trees, as though someone or something was speaking just beyond our hearing. It was a language we couldn't understand. Guys, I whispered, we need to leave. But it was too late. We were already too far in. By the time we started packing up our gear, the air had grown cold, unnaturally so. I could see my breath now, and my skin felt tight, like the air itself was pushing in on me. That's when I heard it again, the breathing. Closer this time, right behind me. I spun around, expecting to see one of my friends standing there. But there was no one. The rustling continued. The shadows moved, shifting just out of reach of the firelight. And then, through the trees, I saw it again, the shape. This time, it was clearer, a towering figure, its limbs long and thin, his body too gaunt to be human. But the worst part, the part that I'll never forget, was the face. The face was twisted, drawn tight, with hollow eyes and a mouth that gaped open as though it was waiting to consume us all. The Wendigo. We didn't wait around to confirm it. We grabbed what we could, shoved it into the trucks, and sped off into the night. I still hear it sometimes. Even now, the whispering, the footsteps, the soft, slow breathing. And I'll never forget the eyes. Those hollow, hungry eyes. The Wendigo never left us. Story number 4. The Whispers of Clear Air Force Station. I thought it would be easy, a simple assignment to document the state of an old military facility in the middle of Alaska. A few days of work cataloging abandoned equipment, snapping photos of rusted radar dishes, and checking off boxes on a clipboard. That's all I expected. I didn't expect the whispers. Clear Air Force Station had been a Cold War relic, a sentinel standing watch over the vast skies of North America. Its massive radar arrays once scanned for ballistic missile threats, listening to the heavens for any sign of an incoming attack. By the time I arrived in the early 2000s, it was little more than a graveyard of outdated technology, its purpose relegated to the annals of history. I was part of a small team sent to assess the condition of the site and determine what could be salvaged. It was routine work, boring even, but as soon as I stepped onto the base, I felt it, a sense of unease, a heaviness in the air that didn't belong. The base itself was a shell of its former self. The main building, where the radar arrays had been housed, loomed large against the gray Alaskan sky. The wind howled through broken windows, carrying with it the faint scent of metal and decay. Most of the equipment had been decommissioned, stripped for parts or left to rust. Yet, as we walked through the halls, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It started on the second day. I was in the main control room, a cavernous space filled with rows of consoles and monitors that hadn't been powered on in decades. The room was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of the building settling. I was cataloging the equipment, checking serial numbers, when I heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I listened closer, I realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was a voice, a whisper. "Help!" I froze, my pen hovering above the clipboard. The word was faint, barely audible, but it was there. I turned, expecting to see one of my colleagues standing behind me, playing a prank. But the room was empty. "Hello!" I called out, my voice echoing off the walls. No response. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just my imagination, a trick of the wind passing through the cracks in the building. But deep down, I knew better. That night, as we sat around a makeshift camp inside the base, I asked the others if they'd heard anything strange. Greg, one of the engineers, gave me a look. "You heard it too." "Huh?" he said, his voice low. "Heard what?" I asked, though I already knew. "The whispers," he said. "I've been hearing them since we got here. Thought it was just me losing my mind." Lisa, the project lead, laughed nervously. "Come on, guys, it's an old building. Probably just the wind." But I could see the fear in her eyes. She had heard them too. The whispers grew louder as the days went on. At first, they were sporadic, fleeting, but by the end of the week, they were constant. Sometimes, it sounded like a single voice, soft and mournful. Other times, it was a chorus, overlapping whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The worst part? They were coming from the radar arrays. The arrays had been decommissioned decades ago, their circuits gutted, their power long since cut. But every time I walked past the control panel, I heard them, the whispers, faint but persistent, like a ghostly signal trying to break through the static. One night, I decided to investigate. I couldn't take it anymore, the whispers, the unease, the sense that something was watching us. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a tape recorder, I made my way to the radar tower. The tower was massive, a skeletal structure of metal and wires that stretched into the sky. As I climbed the stairs to the top, the whispers grew louder. They weren't words anymore. Not exactly. They were sounds, moans, cries, distorted voices that seemed to vibrate through the air. When I reached the top, I found the source, or at least, I thought I did. The radar dish stood silent, a hulking relic of the past. But as I approached, I felt a vibration beneath my feet, a low hum that seemed to resonate through my entire body. I placed my hand on the control panel, and that's when I heard it. "Help us!" The voice was clear now, louder than before. It wasn't coming from the dish. It was coming from the ground. I don't remember running back down the tower. I don't remember bursting into the main building, gasping for breath as I tried to explain what I'd heard. All I know is that I wasn't the only one. Greg had been in the control room when it happened. He said the monitors flickered on, even though they weren't connected to any power source. And on the screens, he saw them, faces, dozens of them, pale and ghostly, staring out at him from the static. Lisa called it quits the next morning. She didn't say why, but I could see it in her eyes. She'd heard the whispers too. We left Clear Air Force Station later that day, our assignment unfinished. The base was sealed up, left to rot in the Alaskan wilderness. But I couldn't forget what I'd heard, what I'd seen, the whispers, the faces, the feeling of being watched. It stayed with me. And sometimes, late at night, I hear them again, the whispers, the voices, calling out from the static, from the shadows. "Help us!" I don't know what happened at Clear Air Force Station. I don't know what they were experimenting with, what they unleashed. But I know one thing. Something is still there, trapped beneath the surface, waiting for someone to listen. And I fear that one day, someone will. Story number 5. The Alaska Triangle, a journey into the unknown, is a place few people know about, but it's a place that haunts the minds of those who do. The Alaska Triangle, a vast, eerie expanse of wilderness stretching between Anchorage, Juneau, and Barrow, seems to devour people whole. They go in, but they don't come out. Some say it's nothing more than a collection of isolated, unforgiving terrain, while others whisper of something far darker, something that doesn't want them to leave. For me, the stories started long before I ever stepped foot in Alaska. I first heard of it when I was young. Those eerie whispers passed down through generations. People would talk about the disappearances, the strange happenings, and the planes that went down with no wreckage left behind. My father, who worked as a pilot, had his own stories of flying over the triangle. He never spoke much about it, but there was always something in his eyes when the subject came up. A darkness that didn't sit well with me. I should have listened, but I was a young man then, eager for adventure. I wanted to see the world, experience things others only dreamed about. Alaska called to me, and like the fool I was, I answered. It was in the fall of 1995 that I took the first step into that godforsaken triangle. I was on my way to Juneau, traveling with a small crew to film a documentary about the wilderness, the history, the people. But from the moment I arrived, things felt off. It was like the air itself had a weight to it, thick, oppressive, and almost alive. The locals warned me to stay clear of certain areas. Don't go near Barrow at night, they said. Watch out for the fog in Anchorage. But most of all, they told me not to fly over the triangle. Don't fly. It's a warning I ignored. Foolishly, we were scheduled to fly into Anchorage on a small plane, a single propeller craft. My cameraman, Ben, had been especially excited about the flight. He had always dreamed of flying over the rugged, untouched wilderness. I think that's part of why I didn't hesitate. The thought of getting that perfect aerial shot of the endless forests and mountains was too tempting. The plane was small. It felt like a toy compared to the massive stretches of land beneath us. But I didn't think much of it. Ben was busy adjusting the cameras. And the pilot, an older man named Rick, was a seasoned veteran of the Alaskan skies. He'd flown for years, and I trusted him. But trust, like the thick Alaskan fog, can quickly become a trap. As we ascended, everything seemed normal at first. The ground below fell away, and I could see the vast expanse of trees, rivers, and jagged peaks. It was beautiful, but the beauty had a strange, almost haunting quality to it. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched across the wilderness like dark fingers. I could feel it, the weight of something watching us. We'd only been in the air for a few hours when things began to change. It started small, a flicker in the radio static. Then a strange hum that seemed to pulse in time with the beat of my own heart. Rick's face twitched when he heard it, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he fiddled with the controls. But the hum only grew louder. What's going on, Rick? I asked, trying to mask the unease in my voice. Nothing to worry about, he said, a little too quickly. Just some interference. But I could see it in his eyes, the flicker of fear, barely concealed. As we flew deeper into the triangle, I noticed something strange on the horizon. Something I couldn't explain. The sky ahead of us was shifting. Clouds seemed to swirl and move unnaturally. And for a moment, I thought I saw something, shapes, flickering in and out of existence, just beyond the edge of my vision. I tried to focus, but the moment passed as quickly as it came. We're gonna have to turn back, Rick said abruptly. His voice was tight, strained. I had never seen him like that before. I looked out the window, trying to understand. There was nothing but empty space in front of us. Just the endless wilderness, stretching to the horizon. But then the fog rolled in. Thick, heavy, came out of nowhere, obscuring everything. The ground, the trees, even the plane's wings were swallowed by it. And in that moment, the hum grew louder, like a low, pulsing heartbeat echoing through the plane's frame. Something was out there, something alive. Suddenly, the plane lurched violently, and for a terrifying second, I thought we were going down. My stomach dropped. My heart raced. Ben's hand shot out to grab the seat in front of him as the craft twisted through the thickening fog. "Hold on," Rick shouted. His voice cracked with panic. But it was too late. The hum grew to a deafening crescendo, and the world outside seemed to warp, to twist. And then, silence. Nothing. I blinked, disoriented. The fog had cleared. But it wasn't the same fog. The trees looked different. The ground looked different. The mountains, they were all wrong. It was like we had flown through some kind of tear in the fabric of reality. "Rick," I said, my voice trembling, "where are we?" But Rick wasn't answering. In fact, the entire cockpit was empty. I jumped up and stumbled toward the front. But the seat where Rick had been sitting was vacant. No pilot. No co-pilot. Just me. I rushed to the window, scanning the ground below. And that's when I saw it, a small group of figures, standing motionless on the ground, staring up at the plane. Their faces were pale and gaunt, their clothes tattered, their eyes hollow with an emptiness I can't explain. And I knew, deep down, I knew they were lost souls, trapped here in the triangle, unable to leave. I wanted to scream, to pull the controls and turn the plane around. But it was as if my body refused to listen. The plane continued to fly on its own, cutting through the air, deeper into the heart of that forsaken place. As I watched the figures below, one of them slowly lifted a hand, and then that figure smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't even human. It was the kind of smile that makes your skin crawl, the kind that burns itself into your memory, the smile of something that should not exist, yet somehow does. And then the plane lurched again. This time, I didn't know if I would survive. The hum was louder than ever. The figures below were moving, but not in any way that seemed real. I looked back to the cockpit. Rick was there now. He was staring at me with hollow eyes, empty eyes. He mouthed something, but I couldn't hear it over the roar of the hum. I saw his lips move, and they formed the words, "You should never have come here. The rest of the flight is a blur." I don't remember how we landed, or if we even landed at all. I don't remember much of anything except the terror, the fog, and the figure's smile that would haunt me until my dying day. But I do remember this. When I woke up the next morning, I was alone in the plane. No crew, no pilot, no evidence of what had happened. And when I finally returned to civilization, I tried to tell my story. I tried to make them believe me, but the triangle had already claimed me. I haven't spoken of it since. But the hum, it still follows me. Somewhere in the back of my mind. I hear it. I hear it always. And I know one thing for sure. The Alaska Triangle doesn't just take people. It takes souls. Story number 6. The Phantom Hitchhiker. A tale from the backroads of Michigan. It was late. So late that the night seemed to stretch out forever, with no sign of the sun coming up to cut through the inky black sky. Just the rhythmic hum of my tires on the empty Michigan highway, the faint buzz of the dashboard lights, and the soft ticking of the engine keeping me company. I was on a back road, far from the city, miles from any sign of civilization. No lights, no traffic. Just me and the trees that pressed in on either side of the road like dark sentinels. I had been driving for hours, heading home after a long day of work that had stretched into the evening. My eyelids were heavy, my mind wandering. The road was straight, for the most part, winding only slightly through the dense forest. It's the kind of road where you can lose yourself in thought, the silence of the night filling the car as I drove. The kind of road that leaves you thinking about things you can't quite shake. That was the problem. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I saw him at the last minute, standing by the side of the road, just before the sharp bend. He was tall, dressed in a dark jacket and jeans. His thumb stuck out in that universal hitchhiker's gesture. His face was barely visible in the shadow of the trees, but his posture was unmistakable. A man looking for a ride, a figure in the night, just another stranger on a long stretch of road. I didn't hesitate. I had passed more than my fair share of lonely souls trying to get a ride. And I figured I could do the right thing. I slowed down, pulling the car to a stop as I rolled down the window. The cold wind rushed in, biting at my skin. "Need a lift?" I asked. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, a little too still. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, he nodded. I motioned for him to get in. He climbed into the passenger seat without a word, the door creaking as it shut behind him. I couldn't help but feel a shiver run down my spine, but I shrugged it off. The night had been quiet, uneventful. What harm could there be in helping a guy out? We drove on in silence, the road stretching ahead of us in the headlights. I stole a glance at him. He was staring straight ahead, his hands folded on his lap, his face still mostly hidden in the shadows. I wanted to say something, to break the tension, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if something in the air had thickened, pressing down on us both. The silence in the car became suffocating. I glanced at the rearview mirror, then froze. The man was gone. 1 second, he was sitting right next to me, and the next, the passenger seat was empty. His jacket, his jeans, his dark figure vanished. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching as I pulled over to the side of the road. The engine idled, the headlights cutting through the night, illuminating the trees but nothing else. Nothing. I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no sign of him, no trace, no movement in the woods, no sound of footsteps in the leaves. It was as if he had never been there at all. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel. I opened the door, stepping out into the cold night air. The forest around me seemed darker than before, the trees whispering in the wind, the night holding its breath. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking. "Hey, are you still there?" Nothing. The only sound was the wind, rustling the branches overhead. I checked the car again. The passenger seat was still empty, the door where he had climbed in slightly ajar. The air felt thicker now, heavier. Something was wrong, something I couldn't explain. I wanted to get out of there, but I had to make sure that I hadn't just imagined it. I glanced again at the dark road ahead, the headlights casting long shadows along the empty stretch. I'd only been a few minutes down the road after I picked him up. There was no way he could have just disappeared like that. I got back in the car, my heart pounding, and slammed the door shut behind me. The engine sputtered to life, and I threw it into gear, gunning the gas as I sped down the road. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. That was when I saw it, in the rearview mirror, just for a split second. A figure standing at the side of the road, right where I had picked up the man. It was him, the same man, standing there, watching me as I drove away. I slammed my foot on the brake again, the car jerking to a stop. My breath caught in my throat. My eyes flicked to the passenger seat, where he had been sitting just moments before. But the seat was empty. I stared at the road behind me, my mind racing. There was no sign of him now. Nothing but the endless stretch of empty highway. Just me and the trees. I should have driven on. I should have never stopped. But some instinct, told me to look again. So I did. There he was again. This time, he was much closer, standing just off the side of the road, his face now visible, pale, with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the night. His mouth was open, but no sound came out. He didn't move, didn't even blink, just stood there, staring at me. Couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, my hands cold on the wheel. I had to get out of there, but my foot wouldn't move. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone, vanished. I couldn't take it anymore. I threw the car into reverse, spinning the wheel to turn the car around. My tires squealed as I slammed my foot down on the gas, and I drove faster than I had ever driven before. Every nerve in my body was screaming for me to get away, to never look back. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I pulled into a gas station and sat there for what felt like an eternity, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't make sense of it. But the thing I couldn't shake, the thing that haunted me long after that night was the feeling. The feeling that whatever I had picked up on that lonely road, it wasn't just a man. It wasn't just a hitchhiker. It was something else. Something that didn't belong in this world. And it had been waiting for me on that stretch of highway, in the dark, waiting to see if I would be the one to drive into its trap. The legend of the phantom hitchhiker is older than I am, older than the road itself, and older than the town I grew up in. But that night, when I drove through the woods, I learned that sometimes stories aren't just stories. Sometimes they're warnings, and sometimes they're more real than you can ever imagine. Story number 7. The Devil's Tramping Ground. A tale from the edge of reality. There's a place in North Carolina, a patch of land so quiet, so still, that it almost feels like time itself has decided to take a nap. But don't be fooled by its calm exterior. The locals know better. They call it the Devil's Tramping Ground. And if you've never heard of it, I'd advise you to keep it that way. I wasn't always a believer in the supernatural, but after what I've seen, what I've heard, I can't explain it any other way. It all started when a group of us, 3 friends and me, decided to take a camping trip. Nothing fancy, just a few days of getting out of the city, breathing fresh air, and maybe sharing a beer or two around the fire. We had no idea what we were stepping into. We'd heard the rumors. Of course, everyone in the area had a story to tell about the Devil's Tramping Ground, a seemingly normal clearing deep in the woods, where the trees bowed away from a perfect circle in the earth, the kind of circle where nothing grows. Some people said it was a place where the devil himself had walked, leaving his mark on the land. Others swore it was a portal to something far worse. But, like most people, we brushed it off as nothing more than folklore, a good story to tell around campfires. So, when we packed our bags and drove out there, it was with the typical sense of bravado that young people have when they think they're invincible. We didn't take it seriously. We didn't even think about the old warnings. Our campsite was set up just a few miles from the clearing. A small fire crackled between us, sending light and warmth into the cool night air. We joked, laughed, and made plans for the next day, not knowing that by morning, nothing would ever be the same. It started just before midnight. First, it was subtle, like a breeze rustling through the trees, but there was no wind that night, no movement, except for what we felt in the pit of our stomachs, that uneasy sensation that something, or someone, was out there, watching us. We laughed it off at first. "It's just the woods," I said. "It's probably some raccoons or deer. We're just jumpy." But then the noises started. First, it was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, like someone was walking around our camp. Heavy, but not too heavy. Not animal, but human. I remember the exact moment I first heard it. I was sitting by the fire, staring into the orange flames, when I heard the crunch of leaves just beyond the circle of light. My blood ran cold. I thought maybe one of the others had wandered off, but I quickly realized they were all accounted for. We were all sitting in a tight circle, still and silent, the fire flickering between us. "Did you hear that?" Matt whispered, his voice a tremor in the otherwise still air. He didn't have to ask. We'd all heard it. Those footsteps. It wasn't just that we heard them. It was the way they circled us. The way they walked just outside the light, but never entered it. As if whatever was out there knew not to step into the fire's glow. It knew we could see it then. We waited. We didn't move. We didn't speak. Then, just when the silence seemed unbearable, the wind picked up, not in a natural way. It was like the trees themselves were bending inward, as though the very forest was closing in on us. The fire sputtered as the air grew cold, far too cold for a late spring night. The smell of earth, damp and sour, filled the air, and that's when we saw it. It wasn't something you could describe clearly. It was more like the absence of something, a shadow in the shape of a person, moving just outside the edge of our vision. The shape flickered, distorted, like it was struggling to remain solid. But it didn't matter because it was real. We all saw it. "Who's there?" I called. But the voice in my throat felt like it didn't belong to me. The words sounded wrong, echoing in the air with a sense of finality. My own voice was the only sound that seemed to exist in that moment. It swallowed the silence. And then, just like that, the footsteps stopped. Silence. Absolute and suffocating. We sat frozen. Every muscle in our bodies stiff. As if moving would somehow make things worse. But it was too late. That feeling of being watched, of being hunted, had settled over us like a weight. Something tangible. We could all feel it. I glanced at Natalie. Her eyes were wide, filled with a kind of fear I'd never seen before. Jake was already standing, his pack on his back, ready to go. But we didn't move. We couldn't. It was then that the things started to move. Small at first, my flashlight, my sleeping bag, my backpack all shifting slightly, like they were being nudged. But it wasn't the wind. It wasn't anything natural. There was a force behind it. Something purposeful. Something that wanted us to leave. Or worse, to stay. The air around us grew thick, heavy. And then I heard it. A sound so chilling I can still hear it in my nightmares to this day. Laughter. It was faint at first, like a whisper, but it grew louder and clearer until it filled the air, ringing in my ears. It wasn't human laughter. It was the sound of something ancient, something vile, and it was mocking us. That's when we ran. We didn't pack up our things. We didn't stop to think. We just ran, faster than I've ever run in my life. We didn't look back. I don't know how long we ran, but when we reached the edge of the woods, when we were finally back on the road, we dared to look behind us. The woods were silent again. The footsteps were gone. The laughter had stopped. But something stayed with us. We never spoke about that night again. Not to each other. Not to anyone else. It was as if speaking of it would make it real again. Would bring back the force that had followed us. The feeling that we were being hunted. And though the next morning the sun was bright and warm, there was a chill in my heart that never left. We never went back to the devil's tramping ground. And if you ever find yourself near there, if you ever hear the rumors, see the clearing, or feel the cold brush of a breeze that isn't really a breeze, run. Don't look back, because whatever is out there, it's still waiting.